The shot exploded through the morning calm of redemption. Gulch, a percussive crack that sent a flock of sparrows scattering from the eaves of the First Territorial Bank. Dust, fine as powdered bone, billowed from the street as 3 riders thundered to a halt, their horses screaming in protest. Inside the bank, Eliza Mayhew clutched the small velvet pouch in her hands, her knuckles white. The air, thick with the smell of oiled leather and stale cigar smoke, was now electric with fear. A man in a long gray duster kicked the door open, a Colt Peacemaker held steady in his gloved hand. His face was a roadmap of hard living, but it was the scar that drew the eye, a jagged silver line that cut from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, pulling his lip into a permanent sneer. On the floor, he snarled the words scraping from his throat like stones. All of you. The bank's few patrons, a stout merchant, a young couple, and the elderly teller, Mr. Abernathy, dropped without a sound, their faces pressed against the grimy floorboards. Eliza hesitated for a fraction of a second. The velvet pouch contained her mother's silver locket, a final gift before the fever took her 5 years ago. It was the one object that held the ghost of her touch, the echo of her voice. She had only brought it to town to have the delicate clasp repaired by the blacksmith. I said on the floor, the scarred man repeated his voice, dropping to a menacing growl. He strode toward her, his boots thudding on the wooden planks. Eliza sank to her knees, tucking the pouch into the pocket of her dress, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kept her head down, her gaze fixed on a loose floorboard, praying they only wanted the bank's money. She could hear the other 2 robbers behind the counter, the clatter of coins being swept into canvas bags, Mr. Abernathy's terrified whimpers. The scarred man stopped directly in front of her. The smell of whiskey and sweat washed over her. "What's that in your pocket, girl?" "Nothing," Eliza whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's nothing of value." He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Everything's got value to someone." Before she could react, he reached down, and his fingers closed around the velvet pouch, yanking it free. He was rough, his grip like iron. He opened the drawstring and let the locket fall into his palm. It lay there, gleaming against his grimy skin, the intricate floral engravings, a stark contrast to his calloused hand. He didn't glance at it with the detached interest of a common thief. He stared at it. His scarred face tightened, his eyes narrowing as if studying a long-lost memory. For a moment, the chaotic noise of the robbery seemed to fade, and there was only the tense silence between them. He ran his thumb over the engraving, a strange, almost reverent gesture that sent a chill down Eliza's spine. This wasn't random. "Please," she begged, daring to look up at him. "It was my mother's. It's all I have left of her. Take anything else." The flicker of recognition in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, deliberate cruelty. He curled his fingers around the locket, making a tight fist. Should have left it at home. He tucked it into his own pocket, and the gesture sharp and final. He hadn't stolen a piece of jewelry. He had stolen a piece of her soul. "Get the rest," he barked at his men. "We're done here." They were gone as quickly as they had come, leaving behind a cloud of dust, a ransacked bank, and a silence more terrifying than the noise. Mr. Abernathy was sobbing behind the counter. The young couple clung to each other, but Eliza remained on her knees, staring at the empty space where the man had stood. The violation was sharp and absolute, a personal wound that had nothing to do with money. They had taken the one thing that could not be replaced. In that moment, the wild, unforgiving land outside seemed to call to her, not with a threat, but with a promise. A promise of justice she knew she would never find within the dusty, broken confines of Redemption Gulch. She would get it back, no matter the cost. Redemption Gulch was a town gasping for breath. The red sand that formed its single sorry street glowed like embers under the unforgiving sun, and the wind whispered through the skeletal frames of half-finished buildings, a constant reminder of promises that had died of thirst. The creak of the saloon doors, the clanging of the blacksmith's hammer, the low murmur of weary voices. These were the sounds of a community slowly being strangled. The source of that strangulation had a name: Silas Kane. Kane was a man who moved like a shadow, his wealth a mystery, and his ambition a plague. He had arrived 2 years ago with a fat wallet and a smile that never reached his eyes, buying up failing ranches for a pittance. He spoke of progress of a railroad spur that would bring prosperity, but his methods were those of a vulture circling a dying animal. He dammed the creek that fed the valley, turning fertile pastures to dust. His fences cut off traditional grazing lands. His men hired guns with cold eyes, and quick tempers rode the perimeter of his ever-expanding empire, ensuring no one got any ideas about fighting back. Eliza's father, John Mayhew, was one of the last holdouts. He was a man carved from the same stubborn rock as the mesas that overlooked their small ranch, his pride as vast and weathered as the land itself. He had buried his wife in that land, and he'd sooner be buried beside her than sell her memory to a man like Kane. The day after the robbery, Eliza found him by the corral. His shoulders slumped, his face a mask of weary resolve. The dust from the parched fields had settled into the lines around his eyes, making him look 10 years older. He offered again, John said, not looking at her. His voice was rough, dry as the earth under his boots. Kane's man was here this morning. The offer is lower this time. We're not selling, Pa. Eliza said, her own voice, harder than she intended. The theft of the locket had forged a new resolve in her, a steel edge to her spirit. It's not about selling anymore, Liza. He sighed, finally turning to face her. It's about surviving. The cattle are thin. The creek bed is bone dry. Kane owns the water, and a man who owns the water owns everything. His words hung in the hot, still air. The hope that had once been the lifeblood of their ranch was gone, replaced by a quiet desperation. This was Kane's strategy, not to break a man with force, but to watch him break himself against the slow, grinding reality of ruin. That evening, as the sky bruised purple and orange, 2 of Kane's men rode up to the ranch. They didn't dismount, sitting high on their saddles, their figures silhouetted against the dying light. They were the same men who patrolled the fences, their faces hard and expressionless. Evening, Mayhew, one of them called out, his voice laced with casual contempt. Mr. Kane was wondering if you'd reconsidered his generous offer. My answer's the same, John said, stepping out onto the porch, his shotgun held loosely in his hand. This land isn't for sale. The rider chuckled. That's not the answer Mr. Kane wants to hear. He gestured with his chin toward the barn. That's a mighty old barn you got there. Dry as tinder. A stray spark could bring it down in minutes. Shame to lose your winter hay. The threat was clear, wrapped in the guise of friendly concern. Eliza watched from the doorway, her heart cold with fury. This was how Kane operated, with veiled threats that left no proof, only fear. John's grip tightened on the shotgun. You get off my land. The second rider spurred his horse forward, stopping just short of the porch steps. He leaned down, his face uncomfortably close to John's. You're an old man, Mayhew. Pride is a luxury you can't afford. He suddenly straightened up, and his horse, spooked or commanded, reared back. Its hoof lashed out, catching John in the shoulder and sending him staggering back against the porch railing, which splintered with a sharp crack. Pa. Eliza screamed, rushing forward. The men laughed as they wheeled their horses around. Just a clumsy animal, the first one called back over his shoulder. You be careful now. They rode off, their laughter swallowed by the encroaching darkness. John was on the ground, his face pale with pain, his arm hanging at an unnatural angle. His shoulder was dislocated, and a deep gash was bleeding freely. As Eliza knelt beside him, tending to the wound with shaking hands, a cold, hard clarity settled over her. Cain's men had not just intimidated her father. They had broken a part of him, and the town would do nothing. The next morning, she rode into Redemption Gulch, her father's arm, bound in a sling, the memory of his pained silence burning in her mind. She went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a man whose spine seemed to have dissolved years ago, leaving him slumped behind his desk like a sack of grain. He listened to her story, his eyes shifting nervously toward the window that overlooked the street. "Now, Miss Mayhew," he said, clearing his throat. "Are you sure it wasn't an accident? Horses can be unpredictable." "They threatened him," Eliza insisted, her voice tight with suppressed rage. "They work for Silas Cain." This was a message. Brody sighed, running a hand over his balding head. "Cain owns half this town, including the mortgage on this office. There's no proof. It's your word against theirs. My hands are tied." His hands weren't tied. They were tucked safely in Silas Cain's pockets. Eliza stared at him, at the tarnished badge on his chest, and knew she was utterly alone. The law in Redemption Gulch was a sham. Justice was a word people whispered, but no longer believed in. She walked out of the office, the morning sun feeling cold on her skin. She was standing in the middle of the street, directionless, when she heard a low voice from the covered porch of the blacksmith shop. "Sheriff ain't gonna help you," said Jedediah the blacksmith. His face smudged with soot, his massive arms crossed over his leather apron. His words were blunt, earthy. "No one in this town will cross Cain." "Then what am I supposed to do?" Eliza asked, the desperation she'd been holding back finally cracking her voice. Jedediah spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "If you want to track a wolf, you don't ask a sheepdog for help. You find another wolf." He paused, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "There are whispers," he said, his voice dropping lower, "about a man who lives in the canyons. An Apache. They say he can track a ghost across bare rock. They call him Kale." The saloon owner, cleaning a glass behind his bar, had overheard. He was a wary, quiet man who saw everything. He simply nodded once, a silent confirmation. The name settled in Eliza's mind. Kyle, an Apache tracker. Her parents had warned her about the Apache, painting them as ruthless shadows. But the men who had hurt her father and stolen her past were not shadows from a ghost story. They were real, and they walked the streets of her town without fear. Standing there in the heart of a town that had surrendered, Eliza made her choice. If the law wouldn't help her, she would find her own. If civilization had failed her, she would turn to the wilderness. She would find this man, Kyle. Her quest for a stolen locket had just become a hunt for something far bigger: retribution. The trail to Kyle was not a path, but a riddle written in stone and sand. Eliza followed the vague directions Jedediah had given her, pushing deeper into the jagged canyons that clawed at the edge of the desert. The landscape was a testament to nature's indifference, a place of stark beauty and brutal hardship. The sun was a hammer, the silence a living thing that pressed in on her from all sides. For 2 days she saw nothing but buzzards circling on the thermals and the occasional rustle of a lizard in the sagebrush. She found him on the 3rd day, not because she was a skilled tracker, but because he allowed himself to be found. One moment, she was leading her horse through a narrow pass. The next, he was there standing on a ledge of rock above her, as still and silent as the stone itself. He hadn't made a sound. He seemed to have emerged from the earth, a figure of sun-bronzed skin and wind-whipped black hair tied back with a leather cord. His eyes, dark and piercing, watched her with an unnerving intensity, as if he had been observing her for hours. Her heart leaped into her throat. This was one of the men her father had spoken of in hushed, fearful tones. But looking at him now, she felt not terror, but a profound sense of awe. He wore no weapon in his hand, but a bow was slung across his back and a knife was sheathed at his hip. His presence commanded the space around him. "I'm looking for a man named Cale." She called up, her voice sounding small and fragile in the vast emptiness. He did not answer immediately. He simply studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a fluid grace that seemed to defy gravity, he leaped down from the ledge, landing silently on the sandy ground, a few paces from her. "You found him," he said. His voice was a low rumble, his English direct, stripped of all unnecessary adornment. There was no accent she could place, only a careful, deliberate cadence. Eliza took a breath, gathering the courage that had carried her this far. "I need your help. I need you to track 3 men. They're outlaws. They robbed the bank in Redemption Gulch." Cale's gaze swept over her, taking in her dusty dress, the determined set of her jaw, the exhaustion in her eyes. "The white man's business is not mine." He turned as if to leave. "They took something from me," she said quickly, her voice pleading. "A silver locket. It belonged to my mother." She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a small canvas sack of coins, most of what her father had saved. "I can pay you." He glanced at the money with disinterest, then his eyes returned to her face. "Your silver cannot buy back ghosts." Desperation made her bold. "It's not just the locket. These men, I think they work for Silas Kane, the man who is choking our valley." At the mention of Kane's name, a flicker of something interest, perhaps recognition, crossed his face. It was there and gone in an instant, but Eliza saw it. "Kane's affairs are also the white man's business," he said, his tone flat dismissive. "But he's hurting everyone, my family, the whole town. His men injured my father," she insisted, her frustration mounting. This was her last hope, and it was slipping through her fingers. She remembered the blacksmith's words, a last-ditch effort. "Jedediah said you could track a ghost across Bear Rock." Cale stopped. He turned back slowly, his eyes narrowing. "You spoke with the iron shaper?" "Yes. He said you were the only one who could help." He was silent for a long time, the wind whistling softly through the canyon. He walked over to where her horse stood and knelt, examining the tracks she had left. Then his gaze shifted, moving past her tracks to the wider landscape. His focus was so intense, it was as if he were reading a story written on the ground, a story invisible to her. Finally, he stood up. "The men you seek," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "One of their horses was shod with a bent nail on the right forefoot. It leaves a mark, a scratch beside the print." He looked directly at her. "I have seen that mark before, near the lands Kane has taken." Eliza's heart pounded. It was the connection she needed, the first real thread of proof. Cale looked from her to the distant hazy outline of the mesas. His motivation was not the locket, nor her money, nor her plight. It was the mark on the trail, a single repeating flaw that tied the bank robbers to the slow poisoning of the valley. Kane was his business after all, though, for reasons he did not share. "I will track them," he said. "The decision was made. But not for your silver." He gestured toward the sack of coins. "Keep it. You will need it. This trail will be hard, and Kane is not a man who leaves his enemies breathing." Their partnership began not with a handshake, but with a shared, unspoken purpose. As she followed him deeper into the wilderness, Eliza felt a fragile sense of hope. Kyle was a man of few words, his world one of signs, scents, and silences. Hers was a world of books, emotions, and spoken promises. They were from different universes, yet for now their paths had merged, drawn together by the long shadow of Silas Kane. The trail led them north into a labyrinth of sun-scorched plains and rust-colored canyons. Kyle moved through the landscape not as a visitor, but as a part of it. He read the story of the outlaw's passage in a single broken twig, a disturbed patch of pebbles, the faintest scuff of a boot on stone. For Eliza, the land was a beautiful but hostile void. For Cale, it was a living page, every detail. A word, every shadow, a sentence. He taught her to see. He showed her how a horse laden with heavy sacks of coin leaves a deeper print than one carrying only a rider. He pointed out how the outlaws, confident in their escape, had ridden hard and straight, not bothering to cover their tracks. Fear makes a man careful. He said, his voice a low murmur against the vast silence. Arrogance makes him loud. Their days fell into a rhythm of hard riding and quiet observation. Their nights were spent by small, smokeless fires, the star-dusted sky, a breathtaking canopy above them. In these quiet moments, the chasm between their two worlds began to shrink. The silence that had initially felt awkward to Eliza became a comfortable space filled not with unspoken tension, but with mutual respect. One evening, as he sharpened his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, the only sound, Eliza found herself telling him about her mother. She spoke of her love for books, for the pressed wildflowers she kept between the pages of a worn poetry collection. Kyle listened without interruption, his dark eyes fixed on the fire. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he pointed to a cluster of stars burning brightly in the night sky. "My people call those the Seven Sisters," he said. "They are forever running from a great hunter. A story is a map to the spirit. Your mother gave you a good map." It was the most he had ever said about himself or his beliefs, and the simple words resonated deeply within her. He understood loss. He understood the power of memory. She realized his stoicism was not a lack of feeling, but a shield for a world of thoughts and emotions he kept carefully guarded. A week into their journey, the sky turned a bruised, angry gray. The air grew heavy and thick, charged with an energy that made the hairs on Eliza's arms stand on end. Kyle stopped, his head tilted, sniffing the wind. "A storm comes," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "A bad one." They found shelter in a shallow cave, carved into the side of a cliff, just as the heavens opened up. Rain fell in solid, blinding sheets, and lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, followed by peals of thunder that shook the very ground beneath them. Trapped in the small, dark space, they were closer than they had ever been. The scent of rain-soaked earth filled the cave, mingled with the faint, clean scent of sage that clung to Kyle's clothes. The storm raged for hours. As the temperature dropped, Eliza began to shiver, her wet clothes clinging to her skin. Without a word, Kyle removed the dry wool blanket from his pack and draped it around her shoulders. His fingers brushed against her neck, a brief, accidental touch that sent a jolt of warmth through her. A warmth that had nothing to do with the blanket. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He simply nodded, his face a mask of shadows in the dim light. They sat in silence, listening to the fury of the storm and the space between them charged with a new and potent awareness. It was more than just respect now. It was a connection forged in shared hardship, a bond built in the quiet language of gestures and glances. The next day, the storm had passed, leaving the desert washed clean and gleaming. They found the outlaws' trail again, and it led them to an abandoned homestead tucked away in a hidden valley. The place was deserted, but the signs of recent occupation were everywhere: the embers of a fire, discarded food tins, fresh horse droppings. While Cale circled the perimeter, reading the tracks, Eliza searched the dilapidated cabin. In a dark corner, half buried under a pile of filthy rags, she found a wooden crate stamped with the initials S.K. Inside were supplies, ammunition, dried rations, and several tins of expensive imported tobacco, the same kind Silas Kane was known to smoke. It was the first concrete link between Kane and the robbers. But there was something else. Tucked into the bottom of the crate was a small leather-bound journal. Eliza opened it, her hands trembling. Most of it was filled with crude tallies and numbers, but on the last few pages was a list of names. She scanned them quickly: Abernathy, Miller, Thompson, and Mayhew. It was a list of all the ranching families Kane was trying to drive out. Then she saw it at the top of the list, a name that had been crossed out: Blackwood Mine. Below it, another name: Eleanor Mayhew. Her mother. A cold dread washed over her. The Blackwood Mine had collapsed over a decade ago, a terrible disaster that had killed dozens of men and a few women who worked in the sorting sheds, including, she had always been told, her mother. The official story was that it was a tragic accident caused by unstable geology. But here was her mother's name on a list written by outlaws, funded by Silas Kane. "Cale," she called out, her voice thin and reedy. He appeared in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light. He saw the journal in her hands, the look of horror on her face. He came to her side, and she pointed to her mother's name, her fingers shaking. Cale looked at the name, then at the crate with Kane's initials. His face was grim. "This is not just about land," he said softly. "This is about the past. A past someone wants to bury." The locket was no longer just a piece of jewelry. It was a key. And the robbery was not a random act of greed. It was the first move in a much older, deadlier game. The trail had led them not just to a band of outlaws, but to the edge of a dark secret, a tragedy that tied Silas Kane, her family, and the stolen locket together in a web of vengeance she was only beginning to understand. The discovery in the abandoned cabin shifted the very ground beneath Eliza's feet. Her personal quest for a stolen heirloom had fractured, revealing a deeper, more sinister fault line that ran straight through her family's history. The Blackwood Mine. Her mother's name on a list: Silas Kane. The pieces were a dark mosaic she couldn't yet assemble, but the picture they were forming filled her with a chilling certainty this was all connected. They had to get back to Redemption Gulch to warn her father to understand what the list of names meant. But Kane was not a man to be underestimated. As they rode south, Cale's vigilance intensified. He no longer followed the outlaws' trail, but moved along the high ridges, using the terrain for cover, his eyes constantly scanning the vast expanse below. Twice he pulled them to a sudden halt, pointing to a distant plume of dust. Kane's patrols. They were searching. Not for the robbers, Eliza realized, but for them. Kane knew his camp had been found. He knew they were coming. The journey became a tense game of cat and mouse. They traveled by night, resting during the hottest part of the day in hidden arroyos or behind sheer rock faces. The shared danger tightened the bond between them, stripping away the last of their reservations. Eliza found herself relying on Cale's instincts, implicitly trusting his silence more than she had ever trusted anyone's words. He in turn began to see past the sheltered girl she had been recognizing, the core of resilient steel she possessed. He saw the way she pushed through exhaustion without complaint, the intelligence in her eyes as she absorbed everything he taught her. They needed more than suspicion. They needed proof, something that would turn the town against Kane, something Sheriff Brody couldn't ignore. The answer lay in Kane's office at the edge of town, a fortified brick building that served as the nerve center of his operations. It was a foolish, desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. Under the cloak of a moonless night, they slipped into Redemption Gulch. The town was asleep, the only sounds the creak of a weather vane and the lonely howl of a distant coyote. Kyle moved with the silence of a phantom, a shadow gliding through other shadows. He disabled the lone guard with a swift, non-lethal strike from behind his movements, a blur of deadly efficiency. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs as she picked the lock on the office's back door, a skill her father had taught her for mending stubborn farm equipment, never imagining it would be used for this. The office was opulent, a stark contrast to the town's weary poverty. A massive oak desk dominated the room, the air thick with the scent of Kane's expensive tobacco and leather-bound books. While Cale stood watch at the window, Eliza frantically searched the desk. Drawer after drawer revealed nothing but land deeds and business correspondence. Her hope began to fade. Then she saw it, a small locked compartment cleverly hidden in the desk's ornate woodwork. Using a letter opener, she painstakingly worked the lock until it clicked open. Inside was a heavy iron-bound ledger. She opened it. The first few pages were meticulous financial records, detailing payments to his patrols, the cost of damming the creek, bribes to territorial officials. And there, a series of large, regular payments to a name she recognized, the scarred man who had stolen her locket. His name was Cole. This was the proof they needed. But as she turned the pages, she found something else. The ledger wasn't just about finances. It was a chronicle of obsession. Toward the back, Kane had listed the families connected to the Blackwood mine disaster, the foreman, the engineer, the members of the board of inquiry that had ruled it an accident. Her father's name was there next to the word foreman. Next to each name, Kane had detailed his plan to acquire their land, to ruin them financially, to systematically erase them from the valley. It was a blueprint for revenge. Then, on the final page, written in a cramped, angry script, was the entry that made her blood run cold. A name, Silas Kane, false. True name, Elias Vance. The name struck her like a physical blow. Elias Vance. A name from her father's stories, whispered late at night with a mix of guilt and sorrow. He was an engineer at the mine, a brilliant but volatile man who had argued bitterly with the foreman, her father, about safety protocols just weeks before the collapse. Vance, his wife, and his young daughter had all perished in the disaster. Or so everyone had believed. Cale, she whispered, her voice choked. He's alive. Suddenly, the front door of the office crashed open. Two of Kane's men stood silhouetted in the doorway. Lanterns held high rifles leveled. They had been discovered. A trap had been sprung. Cale reacted instantly. He shoved the massive desk over, sending it crashing to the floor and providing them with a sliver of cover as the first shot splintered the wall behind them. He grabbed Eliza's arm, pulling her toward the back window. Go, he yelled, drawing his knife. He met the guards in a flurry of motion, a whirlwind of calculated violence designed to disarm, not to kill. Eliza, clutching the ledger to her chest, scrambled through the window and dropped into the dark alley below. Cale followed a moment later, a shallow cut bleeding on his forearm. Alarms were sounding now, shouts echoing through the sleeping town. They had the proof, but they had been compromised. They raced through the back alleys to where they had hidden their horses, their only thought to get to the Mayhew ranch, to get to her father before Kane could. The ride was a frantic, desperate gallop against time. The eastern sky was already turning a pale, sickly gray as they crested the final hill overlooking the ranch. The homestead was quiet. Too quiet. No light burned in the window. No smoke curled from the chimney. A terrible premonition seized Eliza. She slid from her horse before it had even stopped running toward the house, screaming her father's name. The front door was ajar. Inside, a lantern lay smashed on the floor and a chair was overturned. Her father was gone. Pinned to the kitchen table with a hunting knife was a single piece of paper. The handwriting was the same as the one in the ledger, sharp, angry, and precise. The daughter for the father. Your debt is long past due. Come to the Blackwood mine. Come alone, or he pays for your sins as well as his own. The second obstacle had slammed down with brutal finality. Cain didn't just know they had the truth. He had her father. He was luring her back to the place where it all began, to the source of his all-consuming hatred. The ledger in her hands felt impossibly heavy, its secrets now a death warrant for the man she loved most. The sky wept. A cold, driving rain lashed down from the heavens, turning the trail to the Blackwood mine into a treacherous river of mud. Thunder growled in the distance, a low, constant threat, as if the mountains themselves were groaning under the weight of old sins. Each flash of lightning illuminated the skeletal ruins of the mine's entrance, a gaping black maw in the side of the mountain, framed by rotting timbers and the rusting skeletons of ore carts. This was not just a place of industry. It was a tomb. Eliza dismounted her hands, shaking the ledger, tucked safely inside her coat. Kyle stood beside her, his face grim, the rain plastering his black hair to his temples. "You are not going in there alone," he stated, his voice quiet but absolute. "He'll kill my father if he sees you," she argued, her own voice tight with fear. "He will kill him anyway," Kale countered. "This is not about a trade. This is about an ending. His ending." He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch steady and reassuring. "I will not be seen. Go. I will be the shadow at your back." She nodded, trusting him. She took a deep breath, the damp, earthy smell of the mine filling her lungs, and stepped into the darkness. The air inside was cold and stagnant, heavy with the scent of wet stone and decay. Her footsteps echoed unnervedly in the oppressive silence. The main tunnel was shored up with massive timbers slick with moisture. Deeper in, she could see the flickering light of a lantern. She found them in a large central chamber. Her father was tied to a support beam, his face bruised and swollen, but his eyes were defiant. Silas Cain Elias Vance stood before him holding a lantern high. He was no longer the polished, controlled landowner. The mask was gone, revealing a man hollowed out by grief, his eyes burning with a feverish, haunted light. The scarred outlaw Cole stood guard nearby, his rifle held ready. "You came," Cain said, his voice echoing strangely off the damp rock walls. "I knew you would. A daughter's love is a powerful thing, a weakness I can exploit." "Let him go, Cain," Eliza said, her voice stronger than she felt. "This is between you and me." Cain laughed, a chilling, broken sound. "Oh, it was never about you, girl. It has always been about him." He gestured with the lantern toward her father. "The great foreman, John Mayhew. The man who signed the death warrants for 37 people, my wife and my child among them, because he was too ambitious to listen, too cheap to spend the money on the proper supports. It was a geological fault," John Mayhew rasped, his voice raw. "The inquiry proved it. The inquiry was a lie." Cain roared, his voice cracking with anguish. "A lie you all agreed to tell to protect yourselves. I warned you. I showed you the fissures in the rock, the strain on the timbers. But you wanted to meet the deadline to get that bonus. You called me a coward for wanting to delay." The pieces of the past slammed into place in Eliza's mind. This wasn't about greed. It was a scorched earth campaign of vengeance, meticulously planned for over a decade. "So you survived," Eliza said, trying to keep him talking, trying to buy Kale time. "You became Silas Cain, and you came back to destroy everyone you blamed." "I was buried for 2 days," he whispered, his eyes distant, lost in the memory. "I listened to the mountain groan. I heard the last breaths of my wife. When they finally dug me out, I was the only one left from that section. They thought I was a miracle. I knew I was a ghost left behind to collect a debt of blood. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket. It dangled from his fingers, catching the lantern light. "You thought this was your mother's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were wrong." He opened the clasp. Inside there was no portrait of her mother. There was a tiny faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a young girl with a bright, innocent smile. Cain's wife and daughter. "It belonged to my Sarah," he said softly. "She dropped it that morning near the entrance. Your mother found it. She was going to return it to her after her shift." His gaze hardened as he looked at Eliza. "When Cole told me he found a girl in the bank holding it, I knew. Fate had finally delivered the last piece of the puzzle into my hands. The foreman's daughter." A low rumble echoed from deep within the mine, and dust sifted down from the ceiling. The storm outside was growing more violent, and the old mine was protesting. "It ends tonight," Mayhew Cain said, raising a pistol and pointing it at John's head. "Here in the grave you dug for my family." In that instant, Kyle struck. He dropped from a darkened ledge above a silent, deadly force. He took Cole out before the outlaw could even register his presence, a swift blow rendering him unconscious. Cain spun around, firing his pistol wildly into the darkness. The shot ricocheted off the rock, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Eliza lunged forward, grabbing a heavy miner's pickaxe from the wall and using it to cut the ropes binding her father. Another, more violent tremor shook the chamber. A large timber groaned and splintered overhead. The mine was collapsing. "It's over," Vance Eliza screamed over the roar of shifting rock. "This won't bring them back." Her words seemed to hit him harder than any physical blow. His face contorted in agony, the futility of his long crusade crashing down on him in that final moment. He looked at the locket in his hand, then at the collapsing tunnel around him. He had built his entire life around this moment of revenge, and now it was literally falling apart. "Then I will join them," he shrieked, turning his pistol not on them, but toward the main support beam already fractured and groaning. He fired once, twice. The massive timber exploded in a shower of splinters. "Run!" Cale yelled, grabbing John and shoving him toward the entrance. Eliza scrambled after them as the ceiling gave way behind them in a deafening final roar. Rock and earth poured down, burying the chamber, burying Elias Vance and the ghosts of his past forever. They stumbled out into the torrential rain, gasping for breath as the Blackwood mine, the source of so much pain, sealed itself shut, a final permanent tombstone on a legacy of hatred. In the gray, rain-soaked dawn that followed, the world felt strangely quiet. The thunder had receded, leaving only the steady drumming of water on the earth. Eliza Cale and her father found shelter under a rocky overhang, the collapsed mine a grim silhouette behind them. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the heavy weight of truth. John Mayhew sat huddled in a blanket, his face etched with a sorrow that seemed to have aged him decades in a single night. He finally looked at Eliza, his eyes filled with a shame she had never seen before. "He was right," John confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "Vance, he did warn me. There were signs, fissures, but I was young, ambitious. I had a family to provide for. I convinced myself he was being overly cautious. I pushed the men harder. I cut corners on the newer supports." He took a shuddering breath. "When it collapsed, the board of inquiry was made up of my friends. We were all scared. We buried the truth to protect ourselves. I've lived with it every day since." Eliza listened, her heart aching, not with anger, but with a profound sadness. Her father was not a villain, but a flawed man who had made a terrible mistake and been haunted by it his entire life. She moved to his side and took his hand. It felt frail in hers. "You have to live with it," she said softly. "But you don't have to live with it alone anymore." In the quiet exchange that followed, years of unspoken guilt began to wash away. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the start of it. It was understanding. It was grace. Weeks later, Redemption Gulch was slowly breathing again. With Silas Kane gone and the ledger handed over to the territorial marshals, his empire crumbled. The dam was dismantled, and water flowed back into the valley, a trickling promise of renewal. The ranchers, armed with the truth, began the long process of reclaiming their land and their lives. Kyle was no longer a whispered rumor from the canyons. He was a visible ally, treated with a wary but genuine respect by the townsfolk he had helped save. One evening, as the sun set, casting long golden fingers of light across the healing land, Kyle came to Eliza at the ranch. He held out his hand, and resting in his palm was the silver locket recovered from the rubble at the mouth of the mine. It was dented and scratched, but intact. Eliza took it, the metal cool against her skin. For so long, this object had been her singular focus, a symbol of her past, a catalyst for justice. Now it felt different. It was no longer just a vessel for her mother's memory. It was a vessel for Sarah Vance's as well. It held the grief of two families, the weight of a tragedy that had bound them all together. The next morning, she rode out not to the town blacksmith, but back to the site of the Blackwood mine. The area was silent and still, nature already beginning to reclaim the scarred land. She found a small sheltered spot near the sealed entrance, where a patch of stubborn wildflowers grew. There she built a simple cairn of stones, a small, unmarked grave for a woman and child who had been lost for too long. She gently placed the silver locket on top of the stones, its metal gleaming in the morning sun. Keeping it would feel like holding on to the vengeance that had destroyed Elias Vance. Leaving it here was an act of letting go, of breaking the cycle. It was her final answer to his hatred, not justice, but peace. Kyle was waiting for her on the ridge above, having followed at a distance, giving her the space she needed. He didn't speak as she walked toward him, but his eyes held a deep, quiet understanding. She had not only reclaimed her future, she had made peace with a past that wasn't even entirely her own. Together, they stood on the ridge, looking out not at the grave, but at the vast, promising landscape that stretched before them. The valley was greening, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and their future was an unwritten story, a trail waiting to be forged, a life they would build together.